The morning my granddaughter found me sitting alone at the kitchen table, she said I looked like a man waiting for a verdict. Maybe she was right. I had been sitting there for 40 minutes, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold, staring at the frost on the window that looks out over the back field. The field my father cleared by hand. The field I had promised myself would never leave this family. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 63 years old. I live, or I used to live, in the way that word means something whole and unbroken, on a property outside of Orangeville, Ontario, that my father built, and my grandfather before him worked as a hired hand on before eventually buying it outright in 1947. 41 acres. A farmhouse that has had every board replaced at least twice over the decades but still sits on the original stone foundation. A barn that leans slightly to the west because my father never got around to fixing the post that settled after the wet spring of 1968, and I never got around to it either, and somehow that lean became part of the landscape. Part of what it meant to come home. I want to tell you about what happened to that home, and I want to tell you how I almost lost it. And I want to tell you about my daughter-in-law, Patricia, and what she did while my son was learning to breathe again. My son's name is Callum. He is 38 years old. He was a carpenter, good with his hands the way his grandfather was, the way I was never quite able to be. He built custom cabinetry for homes in the Caledon Hills, and sometimes as far as Collingwood. He had a small crew, a good reputation, and a wife he had brought home 7 years ago from a conference in Toronto where they had both ended up at the same table during a networking lunch neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. Patricia was polished in the way that made me initially admire her and later understand that the polish was its own kind of armor. She dressed well, she spoke carefully, she laughed at the right moments. She came from a family in Mississauga, professional people, and she had grown up in a house where the floors were always clean and the calendar on the wall was always full. She and Callum seemed genuinely happy in the early years. They bought a house in Shelburne, about 20 minutes from the farm. They had a daughter, my granddaughter Rosie, who is now 5, and has my mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and who I would do absolutely anything for. Then, 2.5 years ago, Callum fell. He was working on a renovation project, a 2-story addition on a property near Mono. The scaffold was older than it should have been, rented from a company that had deferred maintenance longer than was legal. A platform gave way. Callum fell approximately 4 meters onto a concrete pad. He broke 3 vertebrae, his left wrist, and 4 ribs. He punctured a lung. He spent 11 days in the ICU at Headwaters Healthcare Center and another 3 weeks in a step-down unit before he was stable enough to be transferred to a rehabilitation facility in Barrie. The spinal injury was incomplete, which the doctors explained to me was actually the better kind of terrible news. It meant some signals were still getting through. It meant there was a possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility, of partial or even meaningful recovery. But it also meant pain, constant, grinding, unpredictable pain that changed from day to day and made every hour of rehabilitation feel like a negotiation with his own nervous system. I moved into their house in Shelburne for the first 6 months. Patricia was working, or said she was working, and Rosie needed stability, and Callum needed someone to drive him to appointments in Barrie 3 days a week and to be there when the pain broke through the medication at 2 in the morning. I did not mind. I want to be clear about that. I did not mind any of it. Callum is my son, and there was nowhere else I was going to be. The farm I left in the care of my neighbor, a man named Doug Hartwell, who has farmed the acreage adjacent to mine for 25 years, and who I trust completely. Doug checked the fences, kept an eye on the house, fed the 2 horses. I still keep more out of sentiment than practicality. The property was sitting quiet. It was not going anywhere, or so I believed. I want to tell you about the evening everything shifted, because it did not shift dramatically. It shifted the way ice does on a river in early spring, when you are watching it and nothing seems to be moving, and then all at once there is a crack you felt more than heard, and you understand that something underneath has already changed. It was a Thursday evening. I had driven back from Barrie with Callum after a physio session that had gone well enough that he was in one of his quieter, more reflective moods rather than the exhausted, short-tempered ones. We had stopped at the Tim Hortons on Highway 10, which had become a kind of ritual, and I had a coffee and he had a tea, and we sat in the parking lot for a few minutes the way men in our family have always communicated, which is to say, without using very many words at all. He said the physiotherapist thought his left leg was showing more consistent response. I said that was good. He said yeah. We drove home. Patricia was not there when we arrived. She had texted Callum to say she was having dinner with a colleague from her office, a marketing firm in Brampton where she had been working since before Callum's accident. Rosie was with Patricia's mother, who lived in a condo in Orangeville, and who Patricia had been relying on more and more for childcare as the months went on. I made Callum dinner, something simple, soup from a container and toast, and I sat with him while he ate, and then I helped him get settled for the night, and I drove back to the farm. It was late, past 10. The roads between Shelburne and Orangeville were empty and dark, and I had the radio off and the window cracked because October air at that hour has a quality I have always found clarifying. I was thinking about nothing in particular. I was thinking about the way Callum had looked at his leg during the session, with a focus that reminded me of how he used to study a piece of wood grain before deciding where to make the first cut. Precise, deliberate, hopeful without letting himself be reckless about it. I was not thinking about the property. I was not thinking about Patricia. I was not thinking about anything except my son and the road and the particular smell of autumn in Gray County at 10:15 at night. When I got home, the light in the kitchen was on. I always leave the light above the sink on when I go out. It is a habit from living alone these past 9 years since my wife Margaret passed, God rest her. But the light in the kitchen window looked different somehow, brighter. I stood in the driveway for a moment with my keys in my hand, and I thought, probably nothing. Probably a bulb I had changed without remembering that it had a higher wattage. I went inside. There was a folder on the kitchen table. Not my folder. I have lived in this house for 31 years, and I know every piece of paper in it, and this folder was not mine. It was the kind of folder with the little metal brad through the middle, the kind you use for documents you want to keep organized. It was sitting in the center of the table at a slight angle, as though someone had set it down in a hurry. I stood there in my coat and looked at it for a moment before I opened it. Inside were what appeared to be property assessment documents. My property. My 41 acres. My farmhouse. My leaning barn. But the documents had been altered. I could see it immediately, not because I am a lawyer or a surveyor, but because I know this property's legal description the way I know my own phone number. I have signed documents relating to this land a dozen times over the years. The parcel identifier at the top of the page was correct. The address was correct. The acreage was correct. But the ownership fields had been changed. They listed the primary owner not as Gerald Raymond Whitmore but as Patricia Denise Holloway Bryce, which was Patricia's name before she married my son. There were several other documents in the folder, a draft transfer of title, what appeared to be a power of attorney form, unsigned, with my name typed into the grantor field. Some correspondence I did not immediately understand between what looked like a private real estate holding company and a law firm in Mississauga I had never heard of. I sat down in the kitchen chair. I set the folder on the table in front of me. I am 63 years old, and I have had 2 moments in my life where the world seemed to tilt sideways and require me to grab something to keep from falling. The first was when Margaret's doctor called me at the shop to tell me the scan results were not what we had hoped. The second was this moment. Sitting at my kitchen table in my coat, at 10:30 on an October night, holding documents that told me my daughter-in-law had been planning to steal my family's property. I did not call Patricia. I did not call Callum. I did not call the police. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it, at the same slight angle, and I left the kitchen light on, and I went to the living room and I sat in the dark for a very long time. I want to explain something about why I did not act immediately. Some people, when I have described this moment to them, have asked why I did not simply pick up the phone, and the honest answer is that I needed to understand the size of what I was looking at before I made a single move. When you have lived 63 years and spent most of them on land that your family built their lives on, you develop a certain respect for consequences. You do not swing an axe until you know what is on the other side of what you are about to cut. I also want to be honest about something harder. I sat in that dark living room, and I thought about Callum. About his incomplete spinal injury, and his left leg, and his 2 in the morning pain, and his physiotherapist in Barrie. I thought about Rosie with my mother's eyes, and I thought, if I am wrong about what I am seeing, if there is some explanation I do not understand, if I come in swinging and I am wrong, I will damage something that cannot be repaired. A family that is already fragile. A son who is using every resource he has just to get through each day. So I waited. And while I waited, I learned. I have a friend from my years working property maintenance for the county, a man named Vernon Ashby, who retired 3 years before I did, and who spent a portion of his retirement becoming what he calls a hobbyist in home security because, as he put it, his wife got tired of him having nothing to do and a man needs a project. Vernon had helped me set up a basic camera system at the farm 2 summers ago after there had been some equipment theft in the area. 2 cameras on the exterior, one covering the driveway and one covering the barn entrance. I had never had occasion to look at the footage seriously. The morning after I found the folder, I called Vernon and asked him to come over and help me pull the recordings from the past 6 weeks. I told him I thought someone might have been on the property without my permission. I did not tell him what I had found on the table. Vernon is a good man, but he has a wife who talks, and I was not ready for this to be a conversation in the community yet. What we found on those recordings changed the shape of everything. Patricia had been to the farm 7 times in the 6 weeks prior. 7 times when I was in Barrie with Callum, or at Callum's house in Shelburne overnight, or otherwise away. She had come with a man I did not recognize, a different man on 2 of the visits, both of whom dressed in the particular way of people who spend their days in offices and visit properties for professional rather than personal reasons. They had walked the perimeter. They had photographed the house, the barn, the outbuildings, the fence rows. On one visit, Patricia had gone inside. I could see in the footage that she had a key. I had given her a spare key 3 years ago, so she could water the plants when Margaret and I had planned a trip we ended up not taking because Margaret got sick. I had forgotten she had it. On the most recent visit, 6 days before I found the folder, Patricia and one of the men had been in the house for nearly 2 hours. I sat with Vernon in my kitchen, and we watched the footage, and I told him, then, what I had found on the table. Vernon is 71 years old and has seen a great many things, and he looked at the screen, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Gerald, you need a lawyer before you need anything else." I told him I already knew that. What I needed from him was confirmation that the footage was time-stamped and admissible, and he told me he was fairly certain it was, but that my lawyer would want to verify the technical details. I called a lawyer in Orangeville the next morning. Her name is Sandra Quan LeBlanc, and she has handled property matters in this area for 20 years, and she came very highly recommended by Doug Hartwell, who had used her when he had his own boundary dispute resolved 4 years ago. I went to her office and I brought the folder, which I had carefully photographed before replacing it on the table, and I brought a USB drive with 6 weeks of camera footage, and I sat across from her desk and I told her everything. Sandra Quan LeBlanc is the kind of person who does not perform her reactions. She listened to everything I said and looked at everything I showed her, and then she was quiet for a moment, in the way that good professionals are quiet when they are organizing rather than stalling. Then she said that what I was describing appeared to be an attempted fraudulent transfer of property, which was a serious matter, and that the unsigned power of attorney form in particular suggested that Patricia had intended to forge my signature at some point in this process. She said she wanted to contact the Law Society regarding the Mississauga firm whose name appeared on the correspondence, and that in the meantime I should not confront Patricia, should not change the locks, should not move the folder, and should not tell Callum anything yet. That last instruction was the hardest. For 6 more weeks I drove Callum to Barrie and sat with him at the Tim Hortons and helped him with dinner and watched Rosie when Patricia needed someone to take her. And I knew what I knew, and I said nothing. I want you to understand what that cost. I want you to understand that my son was lying in that rehabilitation facility in Barrie, fighting for every degree of function in his legs, and his wife was in Shelburne and Orangeville and Mississauga trying to pull the ground out from under our family. And I had to sit across from Callum over soup and toast and talk about his physiotherapy progress and not say a single word. I did it because Sandra told me to, and because I understood that doing it prematurely would compromise what she was building. And what she was building was substantial. She had identified the holding company Patricia was working with as a numbered company registered in Ontario, with ties to a development firm that specialized in purchasing rural properties in the Orangeville and Shelburne area for subdivision and resale. She had confirmed with the Law Society that the Mississauga firm had been the subject of a prior complaint related to property transfer irregularities, though nothing had been formally resolved. She had obtained a legal opinion that the documents in the folder, particularly the draft transfer of title, constituted evidence of intent to commit fraud. And she had, quietly and without Patricia's knowledge, registered a notice against the title of my property that would prevent any transfer from proceeding without my explicit involvement. The property was safe, legally protected. Patricia did not know this. I want to tell you about the afternoon it broke open, because it was not dramatic in the way that confrontations are dramatic in films. It was quiet in the way that true things are often quiet. It was a Saturday in late November. Callum had had a particularly good session 2 days before, and his physiotherapist had told us that she was seeing genuine and consistent improvement in both legs, and that she wanted to have a conversation in January about setting some longer-term goals. Callum had cried a little in the parking lot of the rehab center, just briefly, in the way that men who have held themselves together for a long time sometimes do when they receive good news. I had kept my eyes on the dashboard and let him. On the drive back, he had talked more freely than he had in months. He talked about Rosie. He talked about a cabinet project he had been thinking about redesigning from his hospital bed, a new joinery technique he had been reading about. He talked about the farm, about wanting to come out in the spring and walk the fence line when he was steadier on his feet. He said, "You know, Dad, I've been thinking about the farm a lot lately. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to it." I said, "Nothing is going to happen to it." He looked at me for a moment. Callum has always been able to read me better than most people can. He said, "You sure about that?" I said, "I'm sure." 2 weeks later, Sandra called me and told me that Patricia's lawyer had made contact. Apparently, Patricia had discovered the notice on the title and understood that her plan had been exposed. Her lawyer was seeking a conversation. Sandra recommended we decline any informal conversation and allow matters to proceed through proper channels, which they did. I will not walk you through every detail of what followed, because much of it was paperwork and process, and the particular grinding tedium of legal matters, but I will tell you the essential things. Patricia's scheme had involved attempting to use a forged power of attorney to transfer the farm property to the holding company in exchange for a payment she intended to keep. The development firm would then have applied to the county for a rezoning that Sandra's research suggested would almost certainly have been approved, given recent patterns of rural development in this corridor. The 41 acres would have been subdivided. The farmhouse would likely have been demolished. The barn that leaned slightly to the west because of the post my father never fixed would have been gone. Patricia had begun planning this approximately 8 months into Callum's rehabilitation. Her lawyer eventually indicated in negotiations that she had come to believe the farm was the only significant asset available to provide her with financial security if Callum's recovery did not result in his returning to full-time work, that she had convinced herself this was practical rather than criminal. I do not know if that is true. I know that practical reasoning and criminal behavior are not mutually exclusive, and that choosing to frame what you are doing as necessity does not change what it is. She and Callum separated in February. He filed. He told me, when he called to tell me it was official, that he had known for some time that something was wrong, that he had felt it in the way you feel weather coming before there is any visible sign of it, that he had not wanted to add it to what he was already carrying. I told him I understood. We did not talk for very long. Some things between fathers and sons do not require many words. Callum is living now at the farm. He moved in last April, after his physiotherapist confirmed he was safe to manage stairs with a railing. And the farmhouse has a bedroom on the main floor that was originally the sewing room, and which required only minor modification to accommodate his current needs. He walks with a cane on good days and uses a walker on harder days, and he is working 3 days a week doing design consultation for a cabinetry company in Orangeville, the kind of work that uses his knowledge and his eye without requiring him to be on his feet on a job site. His physiotherapist says she expects continued improvement. Rosie comes every second weekend and 1 evening a week. She runs through the farmhouse the way children run through spaces that feel safe to them, with total confidence and no particular destination. She has decided that the 2 horses need names she is allowed to choose, and she has named them Biscuit and Captain, and I have decided that Biscuit and Captain are probably the best names either horse has ever had. Patricia retained custody of Rosie during the week. The arrangement is functional, if not warm. Callum manages it with the same deliberate focus he brings to his rehabilitation and his woodworking, which is to say he does not spend energy on what he cannot change, and he protects carefully what he can. The farm is still here. The stone foundation, the field my father cleared, the barn leaning slightly west. All of it still here. I think about what would have happened if I had not come home that October night. If I had stayed at Callum's house, as I sometimes did on late nights after his appointments. The folder would have been replaced, I assume. Patricia would have continued. The forged signature would have been arranged through whatever mechanism she and her associates had planned. I might not have known until the transfer was registered, and by then the legal complexity would have been significantly greater, though Sandra tells me it still would have been challengeable. Perhaps, perhaps not. Sandra is careful with her certainties. What I know is this: vigilance is not paranoia. Paying attention to your own life, to the details that seem small, is not small. The folder was on my table, at a slight angle, because someone had set it down in a hurry and had not been careful enough. That angle cost Patricia everything she had been planning for months. I also know this: when someone is vulnerable, truly vulnerable, the way Callum was, and in some ways still is, there are people who will look at that vulnerability and see an opportunity. This is one of the harder truths about being human. Not everyone who tells you they love you means the same thing by that word. Some people mean, I love what you have. Some people mean, I love you as long as you remain useful. Some people mean nothing by it at all. Callum was not useful to Patricia in the way she had expected him to be. He could not work a full job site. The workers' compensation case dragged through a process that was slower and more contested than she had apparently anticipated. The financial pressure was real. I do not minimize that. But the distance between financial pressure and fraud is a distance that every person chooses whether or not to cross, and Patricia chose to cross it, and that choice was hers alone. For those of you who have watched someone you love fight their way back from an injury, from an illness, from anything that takes from a person the basic physical confidence of being able to move through the world under their own power, I want to say, do not forget yourself in that fight. I do not mean be selfish. I mean stay awake, stay present in your own life. The people who love you need you, not just as a caregiver, but as a person who is still here, still paying attention, still capable of being surprised by a folder at a wrong angle on a kitchen table. I also want to say, because I think it matters, that I do not carry what happened with bitterness. I have reached the age where I understand that bitterness is a coat you put on for warmth and then cannot take off, and I have enough to carry already without that. What I carry instead is something closer to clarity, about what this land means, about what my son means, about what it costs to look away from your own life and what it saves you to stay present in it. The tea on my kitchen table gets cold sometimes because I am sitting and thinking and not drinking it. That is fine. The mornings here have a quality I have never found anywhere else. The frost on the back field, the leaning barn, the particular silence of 41 acres at 6 in the morning when the horses are still and the day has not yet started and everything that is yours is still there, still standing, still holding. That is enough. That is, in the end, more than enough. If this story has stayed with you, I hope it is because it has reminded you of something you already knew, that the people who need us most deserve our full presence, not just our labor. That love without attention is not protection, that the things worth protecting are often quieter than we expect, sitting at a slight angle on a kitchen table at 10:30, waiting to be seen. Take care of what is yours. Stay awake inside your own life. And if you ever find yourself sitting in a dark room trying to understand the size of something that has gone wrong, remember that understanding before acting is not weakness. It is the beginning of doing it right.